He was abandoned in a wheelchair, but years later he stood before them. Gabriel was just 6 when his parents walked away, leaving him behind in a wheelchair. Years of pain fueled his determination. He defied all odds, becoming a top surgeon. But one night, an emergency call changed everything. His next patient, the father who abandoned him. As Brian lay on the table begging for his life, Gabriel faced an impossible choice. Save the man who destroyed him, or let him die? But what his father revealed next changed everything. Want to know the shocking truth? Watch until the end, and don't miss this story full of emotions and unexpected twists. The cold fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow on the hospital's tiled floor. 6-year-old Gabriel sat in his wheelchair, gripping the armrests so tightly his small fingers turned white. His parents stood in front of him, Brian and Jennifer Carter, silent, avoiding his eyes. He didn't understand. Just an hour ago, they were together in the car, his mother running her fingers through his hair, whispering that everything would be okay. His father had barely spoken a word, gripping the steering wheel with a tension that made the veins in his arms bulge. Now, standing in the sterile hospital hallway, everything felt different. Wrong. Mom. His voice was small, uncertain. When? Are we going home? Jennifer flinched as if the words had struck her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she turned away. His father knelt before him. Brian Carter had always been a towering figure, strong, commanding, but in that moment, he looked weak. Gabriel, he began, his voice raw, you have to stay here for a while. It's for the best. Gabriel's stomach twisted. No, I don't want to stay. Please, I'll be good, I promise. His mother let out a muffled sob. His father clenched his jaw, standing abruptly. A nurse approached. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, it's time. Gabriel's heart pounded. Time for what? His mother bent down, pressing a shaky kiss to his forehead. I love you, she whispered. And then, before he could cling to her, she turned and walked away. His father didn't speak. He just placed a folded piece of paper on Gabriel's lap, then followed his wife out the door. Gabriel's world shattered. Mom! Dad! Don't go! His cries echoed through the hall. They didn't look back. The nurse crouched beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Sweetheart, it's okay. But it wasn't. Gabriel unfolded the paper in trembling hands. The words were scrawled. In his father's handwriting, I'm sorry, it wasn't enough. He screamed, cried, begged for them to return. But the only response was the cold, unyielding silence of the hospital walls. The days after his parents left blurred into one long, aching stretch of loneliness. The hospital became his world, a place of sterile walls, hushed whispers, and the constant hum of machines. Nurses tried to comfort him, but nothing could fill the void left by the people who were supposed to love him most. At night, he gripped the thin hospital blanket and stared at the ceiling, replaying that moment over and over. The way his mother, Jennifer, had kissed his forehead, her lips trembling, the way his father had left that note. I'm sorry. Sorry wasn't enough. Weeks turned into months. No one came back for him. Eventually, social services placed him in a group home for children with disabilities. The first night there, he refused to eat, refused to speak. What was the point? If his own parents didn't want him, why would anyone else? But Gabriel soon learned that weakness meant being forgotten. In the group home, the kids who cried got ignored. The ones who gave up got left behind. And he had already been left behind once, so he decided he would never be weak again. Gabriel threw himself into physical therapy with a fury that startled even his doctors. His legs, fragile from birth, had always been a prison. The doctors had said he might never walk. But Gabriel refused to accept that. He endured every painful session, every grueling stretch, until sweat dripped down his face and his muscles burned. When he fell, he got up. When it hurt, He clenched his teeth and pushed through. At night, when the room was silent, he would whisper to himself over and over, "They were wrong to leave me. They'll regret it." The years passed, and the frail boy in the wheelchair became something no one expected, a force of nature. By the time he was a teenager, he had done the impossible. He could stand, he could walk, and by sheer willpower, he had made himself stronger than the past that tried to break him. But even as he built himself up, one question haunted him. Why did they leave me? He would find the answer one day, and when that day came, he would make them see what they had thrown away. By the time Gabriel turned 18, he had already achieved what doctors once called impossible. He didn't just walk, he ran. He didn't just move, he dominated. Every limitation placed on him as a child had been shattered one by one through sheer will and relentless effort. But that wasn't enough. Strength alone wouldn't prove anything. He needed more. He needed to become someone so great that even the ghosts of his past would have no choice but to see him. Medicine became his weapon. He buried himself in his studies, dissecting textbooks like they held the key to his very existence. He devoured every lesson, every late-night lecture, pushing past exhaustion. While other students partied, he studied. While they slept, he worked. And when people doubted him, when they looked at him and saw only the abandoned boy in the wheelchair, he made sure to prove them wrong. By his mid-20s, he was not just a doctor, he was a surgeon. And not just any surgeon, but one of the best hospitals competed to have him. Patients placed their lives in his hands. His name became synonymous with precision, skill, and brilliance. And yet, no amount of success could erase the scar buried deep inside him. Late at night, when the hospital halls were quiet and the world slowed down, he would find himself staring into the mirror. The reflection was of a man the world admired. But the boy inside, that boy still sat in a wheelchair, watching his parents walk away. No matter how many lives he saved, one question gnawed at him. Why wasn't I enough for them? Gabriel had spent years avoiding that question, but fate had other plans, because one night as he was finishing a long shift, the hospital intercom crackled to life. "Emergency! Incoming patient, male, mid-50s, cardiac arrest, critical condition. We need a surgeon." Now, Gabriel straightened. This was what he did best. He started toward the operating room, already running through the procedure in his mind. Then a nurse rushed up, breathless. "Dr. Carter. The patient's name is—" She hesitated, looking at the clipboard. Gabriel frowned. "Who is it?" She swallowed hard before whispering the words that would bring his world to a standstill. "Brian Carter." The name hit him like a lightning bolt. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. Brian Carter, the man who left him behind. Gabriel froze, his breath shallow. His father, the man who abandoned him, was now lying on an operating table, seconds from death, and he had the power to decide whether he lived or died. The hospital noise faded into a dull hum. Gabriel stood frozen, the clipboard in his hands, his eyes locked on the name, Brian Carter. For years he had imagined this moment, meeting his father again. But never like this, never with Brian helpless, his life hanging by a thread, and Gabriel holding the scalpel. "Dr. Carter!" A nurse's voice snapped him back to the present. "We need to move!" His feet felt like lead, but he forced himself. And forward. The automatic doors to the operating room swung open, revealing the chaos inside. Brian lay unconscious on the table, his skin pale, his chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow breaths. Machines beeped frantically, alarms flashing red. The team looked at Gabriel expectantly. He was the lead surgeon. It was his call. For the first time in his career, doubt crept into his hands. He could let go of the scalpel, walk away. No one would blame him. No one would even know. His father would slip away, and justice, poetic, cruel, and absolute, would be served. But then he looked at Brian's face. Older, weaker, lines of age and exhaustion carved into his skin. He wasn't the towering figure Gabriel remembered. He wasn't the man who had walked away without a second glance. He was just human. Doctor. A surgical assistant looked at him, waiting. Gabriel inhaled sharply, pushing away the storm in his chest. "Scalpel," he ordered. His voice was steady, cold, detached. A nurse placed the instrument in his hand, and with that Gabriel made his decision. He would save his father, not out of love, not out of duty, but because he refused to be like him. The operation began. For the next 4 hours, there was no past, no betrayal, no abandonment, only medicine, precision, and skill. His hands moved with the confidence of years of training, cutting, repairing, and stitching the man who had once left him to fend for himself. Finally, the machine stabilized. The monitors beeped in perfect rhythm. Brian Carter was alive. Gabriel stepped back, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But as he looked at the man on the table, an unsettling thought took root in his mind. What would Brian say when he woke up and realized who had saved him? The recovery room was dimly lit, the steady beeping of heart monitors filling the silence. Gabriel stood at the foot of the hospital bed, arms crossed, watching the man who had abandoned him cling to life. Brian Carter was stable, alive. Gabriel should have felt victorious. He had proved his strength. He had held his father's life in his hands and chosen mercy. But there was no satisfaction, only questions. What would Brian say when he woke up? Would he even remember him? Would he care? A nurse approached. "Dr. Carter, he's waking up." Gabriel's chest tightened. He hadn't prepared for this part. Brian stirred, his fingers twitching against the blanket. His eyelids fluttered before slowly opening, revealing a pair of weary, unfocused eyes. He blinked, adjusting to the sterile hospital lights, his breathing slow and labored. Gabriel stepped in closer. Brian turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on the man in the white coat standing beside his bed. "Doctor?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Gabriel didn't respond. He waited. Brian's tired eyes studied him, lingering on the sharp lines of his face, the intensity in his gaze. A flicker of confusion passed over his features. Gabriel could almost see the thoughts forming in his father's mind. Recognition danced at the edge of his expression, but he wasn't there yet. Gabriel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, the same one his father had left on his lap all those years ago. Silently, he placed it on Brian's chest. Brian frowned, his weak fingers unfolding the paper. His eyes scanned the words, his own handwriting, from decades ago. "I'm sorry." The color drained from his face. His breath hitched. His fingers trembled against the thin paper. Then slowly he looked back up at Gabriel, and this time his eyes widened in horror. Gabriel held his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Hello, Dad." Brian's lips parted, but no sound came out. His entire body tensed, as if the past had suddenly crashed into him with full force. Gabriel let the silence hang between them, heavy and suffocating. Then he spoke again, his voice calm, precise. "I saved your life." A beat of silence. Then, "Now tell me why you ruined mine." Brian's chest rose and fell rapidly, his pulse monitor beeping faster. His fingers clutched the blanket as if it could anchor him to the moment. And then, his voice, barely above a whisper, he murmured the last words Gabriel ever expected to hear. "You think we abandoned you? But we were trying to save you." Gabriel's breath caught in his chest. Trying to save him? His entire life, he had carried the weight of abandonment. He had used it as fuel, as fire, as the very thing that had forged him into the man he was. And now, with a single sentence, his father threatened to unravel it all. He clenched his jaw. "Save me from what?" Brian's eyes glistened with something Gabriel couldn't decipher. Pain, regret, maybe even fear. His voice trembled as he spoke. "You were never supposed to know." Gabriel's stomach twisted. He stepped closer, his voice sharper now. "No." "What?" Brian exhaled shakily. "That night, when we left you at the hospital, it wasn't because we didn't love you." His voice cracked. "It was because we had no choice." Gabriel's fingers curled into fists. "Don't lie to me." "I'm not," Brian rasped. "I wanted to tell you the truth back then, but it was too dangerous. They were watching us. They had already made threats." Gabriel's pulse pounded in his ears. "Who?" Brian swallowed hard. "The people I owed money to." Gabriel felt like the room had tilted beneath him. "I was in deep, son," Brian admitted, his voice hollow. "Millions. More than I could ever pay back. I tried to run, but they made it clear. If I didn't settle my debts, they weren't coming after me." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "They were coming after you." Gabriel's heart slammed against his ribs. "They knew where we lived. They knew where you went to school, and they made me an offer. Either I paid or they'd take you." Instead, the blood drained from Gabriel's face. Brian clenched his fists, his voice raw. "Jennifer wanted to run. She wanted to fight. But I knew we couldn't outrun them, not with you needing medical care, not when they had eyes everywhere." He let out a shaky breath. "So I did the only thing I could think of. I left you. Somewhere they couldn't touch you. A hospital. A place where people would protect you, and then your mother and I disappeared." Gabriel stared at him, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "You expect me to believe that?" His voice was cold, but deep inside, something in him wavered. Brian nodded, his expression desperate. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Walking away from you, leaving you there, knowing you'd hate me for it. It broke me." He swallowed. "But it kept you alive." Gabriel opened his mouth, but no words came. His entire life, he had believed they had abandoned him because he was weak, unwanted, a burden. But if Brian was telling the truth, then everything he had ever known had been a lie. And then Brian whispered the words that made Gabriel's blood run cold. "There's more, son." His voice was barely audible now, his lips trembling. Gabriel's heart pounded. "What?" Brian's eyes filled with tears, his voice cracked. "Your mother. She never stopped looking for you." He swallowed hard. "But they found her first." Gabriel felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "No. No." His knees nearly buckled, but he forced himself to stay standing. "What are you saying?" Brian's voice was barely a breath. "They killed her." Silence. Gabriel felt something inside him break. His mother, Jennifer, the woman whose face he had clung to in his memories, whose voice had echoed in his dreams. Gone. All these years, he had thought she had simply left. That she had walked away just like Brian had, but she hadn't. She had been taken from him. Gabriel's vision blurred. His hands trembled. The fire that had burned inside him for years exploded into an inferno, and for the first time in decades, he didn't know what to do with it. The world felt distant, unreal. Gabriel stood there staring at his father, but he was somewhere else, lost in the storm of his own mind. His mother was dead, murdered. His hands trembled at his sides, and he clenched them into fists to stop the shaking. His entire life he had believed he had been abandoned. He had built himself from the ashes of that pain, fueled by anger, by the desperate need to prove that he was worth something. But now the truth was something far crueler than anything he had imagined. His father had left him to protect him. His mother had died trying to find him, and the people who had destroyed their family were still out there. Brian's voice was hoarse, bleeding. "Gabriel, say something." Gabriel lifted his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Who?" His voice was low, controlled, but underneath, a storm raged. "Who did this?" Brian hesitated, his eyes dark with old fear. It won't change anything. Gabriel's jaw tightened. Who? A long silence, then the Romano family. The name sent a chill through the air. Gabriel had heard it before, in whispers, in news reports, a crime syndicate with deep ties to the underworld, ruthless, untouchable. They don't forget, Brian continued. They don't forgive. I thought if I stayed away, if I disappeared, they'd leave you alone. But if you go looking for them, he swallowed, they'll finish what they started. Gabriel let out a slow breath. The rage in his chest was a living thing, clawing to be set free. For years, he had thought the only battle that mattered was proving himself to the world, becoming more than the boy in the wheelchair. But this was something different. This was justice. This was revenge. His father must have seen the fire in his eyes, because he shook his head. No, you don't understand what they're capable of. Gabriel's voice was eerily calm. And you don't understand what I'm capable of. Brian tried to sit up, wincing. Gabriel, please! But Gabriel had already turned away. He had spent his whole life fighting against ghosts, against an idea of weakness that had never been real. Now, for the first time, he had a real enemy, and he wasn't going to stop until they paid for what they had done. The hospital hallways blurred around Gabriel as he walked. His mind was no longer in that building. It was years in the past, trapped in the moment he lost everything. The Romanos, the people who had destroyed his family. His hands trembled as he stepped into the cold night air. He had spent his entire life trying to prove he was strong. But now, for the first time, he wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for her, his mother, Jennifer. She had never stopped searching for him. And because of that, she was gone. Part of him wanted to go straight to the police, to demand justice, but he knew better. Men like the Romanos didn't go to prison. They didn't answer to the law. If he wanted justice, he would have to take it himself. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A message. Brian, please, son, don't do this. Gabriel stared at the words. His father had made his choice. Years ago, he had run. He had let fear dictate his actions. Gabriel wasn't his father. He typed a response. One word. Goodbye. And then he turned off his phone. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he had to do. He wasn't a helpless child anymore. He wasn't abandoned. He was Gabriel Carter, and he was coming for them. What would you do in Gabriel's place? This incredible true story of resilience, revenge, and redemption leaves one question unanswered. What happens next? Will Gabriel stop? Or is this just the beginning of a new battle? If you were in his shoes, would you choose forgiveness or vengeance? Let us know in the comments, like if this story moved you. Subscribe for more powerful stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more stories that will leave you speechless.